And my next guest is Minister responsible for Indigenous Services Canada, Minister Patti Hajdu. How are you doing there, Minister? Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, it's an honor, and I just want to thank you personally for taking the time, along with the Prime Minister yesterday, to join us in our festivities. And once again, welcome back to the North. And for the people that may not know your journey, can you talk a little bit about who you are and maybe the riding you represent and what brought you into government?
Okay, well, I will try to do the Coles notes. Well, I'm the mother. My mother is a school bus driver. I'm the daughter of a school bus driver, and she was a single mom her whole life. She also had challenges with mental health and substance use, although she hates when I talk about that because there's so much stigma. It's weird, isn't it, to figure out what your story is and how to tell somebody else's story as it relates to your story without somehow disrespecting them. But the reality was that I was removed from her care, and I was placed in the care of my aunt, and I went to live in Chisholm, Minnesota, population 4,000, Iron Range mining town, and I was a bilingual kid. I was born in Montreal. I lost my language, my culture, my mom, all overnight. And then our family had a lot of challenges to recover from all of that. As many people in this room know, that kind of disruption in a family is really hard to recover from. I did eventually reunite with my mom and spent the next 4 years or so with her, but our relationship was so fractured that I left at 16. Eventually got into university, dropped out of university, went back to university once I had a couple kids, graduated at 27 with my BA in anthropology from Lakehead University. First in my family to graduate with a post-secondary education. Changed the trajectory for my boys because they saw their mom working and going to school their whole entire lives. And eventually, as a result of education, I was able to get better and better employment, ended up in public health and then drug policy and then ran a homeless shelter. And I just was getting angrier and angrier and angrier. And I was thinking about Minister McLean's statement, sometimes you have to outweigh a government. The Harper government at the time, the Conservative Harper government, some of you will remember the cruelty, in particular around people who use substances. And I felt that I had to put my name forward. It was a bit of a long shot. Everybody in my community said, who the hell does she think she is? She's never run for any other order of government, all of the kinds of things. I was the first woman to run in my riding for the Liberal Party, and I was the first woman to win in my riding. So I'm the first female MP they've ever had.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And it was just a fast track because I won as member of parliament. After you win as member of parliament, after a big general election, especially if the government changes hands like that, then nothing happens the next day. You're like, what do I do now? I'm elected. What happens? Does someone call me from Ottawa? What happens? And and sure enough, somebody did call me and said, the Prime Minister is considering putting you in cabinet. And lo and behold, he offered me the position of Minister of Status of Women. And that was my first job as a cabinet minister for the federal government. And one of my first acts as Minister of Status of Women was to launch the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women with colleagues Jane Philpott and Jody Wilson-Raybould. And it was an emotional journey. Now, I wasn't a stranger to the stories of people who had experienced trauma, especially Indigenous women on the streets, losing their lives, being abused, and the families that are grieving with them. But nonetheless, the volume of the grief was staggering. And we eventually, with lots of moving and shaking, we got that commission launched, and the rest is history. So since then, I've held 3 other portfolios. I was a Minister of Employment and Labour, and then I was a Minister of Health just as COVID hit. I was very excited. That's where all the drug policy lives, as a Minister of Health. I'm like, yes, finally we can do more on drug policy. And then my entire attention pretty much was consumed by COVID. And then after COVID, the Prime Minister decided to give me this file. And it was a really hard decision, Chief, because this is the locus of control, Indigenous Service Canada. This has for a long time been the minister who's responsible for the Indian Act, the minister who's responsible for the Indian agents. We call them different things now, of course. The minister responsible for deciding who gets what with a very little pot, and the ministers over the years who have done some not great things, but also some great things, like the signatures out there on all of the documents that came from this incredible seminal document. So I thought about it and I thought, how do I do this job with the integrity that I'm not out there telling Indigenous people, here's what the government wants you to know or do, but rather do it differently. And so I chose to do it as an ally and advocate. And I'm very lucky, as you saw yesterday, to have a prime minister who believes strongly in having a voice at the cabinet table, multiple voices fighting for reconciliation. And I said, the only way I can do this is if I'm coming to you saying, this is what Indigenous people want, and fight for Indigenous people at the table. So we agreed that we could all live with those terms, and here I am.
Yes, and you also have family here.
I do. I have a son here. He will also not be happy about this. He's much more private than his mother. But, as you've been speaking, you and previous Chief Smith, about what it means to have an elected parent, I've been reflecting on the journey that our children take when we're elected. And so my boys, of course, have been very supportive of my journey. But when you have a high profile job and you're away a lot and people say, oh, you should have done this or you shouldn't have done that, or the Liberals are stupid or the Liberals are great, all of that affects your kids. Anytime someone sticks their hand up to want to be a leader, you bring your whole family with you, whether you like it or not. And sometimes it's great. And sometimes it's not so great. So the son here is luckily not too rattled by politics. He came here actually with the Yukon Liberals. He was asked to join as a communications professional, and now he's working for the Ministry of Environment. And he loves it here. It's just like Northern Ontario, only better.
Exactly.
Don't tell my writing I said that.
Yes. So, with the 50th anniversary of Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow here now present, how important is it that government, particularly the federal government, reflect on and reconnect on this important moment in our history, let alone the obligation, as you mentioned, as signatory to these agreements?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think the Prime Minister talked about it a lot yesterday, about how this should be the work of First Nations, Indigenous people in the Yukon can show many other First Nations, Indigenous people across the country what it could look like. But the other reflection I had as I looked at the historical documents was how long it took, like 20 years, to get from the charter document to an actual agreement. And what I would say is we have to be better and faster, because in those 20 years, a lot of lives were lost. A lot of elders didn't get to see the conclusion of their work. And a lot of kids suffered through inequitable conditions, situations that not of their own making, that made their journey so much harder. And every year is an important year. So my reflection is on all of that work is that we have to be looking for ways to say, as a federal government, yes, that's a great idea, let's do it now, rather than, that's a great idea, let's ponder and reflect and debate and meet.
Let's do another report.
And let's do another report. And let's do another report. And we have to do a better job doing things immediately. Now, what I've learned in 7 years of being a cabinet minister is there's a lot of space as a minister where you actually don't need the approval of the central agencies, and you can change terms and you can change things that you don't need Treasury Board for. Or maybe you need a really good relationship with the Treasury Board president, and so you should do that work and get your colleagues who maybe aren't as immersed in the space of rights and reconciliation to understand why they have to move more quickly. But speed is of the essence, Chief, because it is actually every generation that is suffering if we don't take action together.
I appreciate that. And one of the challenges that we face as First Nation government, especially when we lobby Ottawa, is that re-education of not only our moment in history, our placement and reasons why. How important is it for your respective colleagues to understand not only the opportunity that's in the territory, but the significance of what's happening here?
It's super important, and I think that's one of the spaces that politics doesn't do a good job at. It's great to see that your deputy premier is Indigenous and knows her community and knows her territory so well from an Indigenous perspective. But there's far too many Indigenous people elected to federal politics. And there isn't a space to do I shouldn't say there isn't a space. The space is not carved out to do the important work, to understand what the roots of this country are. So it's always astonishing to me when I'm in a meeting with other colleagues at all different levels, cabinet ministers or otherwise, who don't know the history of the colonization of a particular region, or even some cases at all, who are in the space of discovery of the shameful roots of how land was stolen, who have a hard time coming to terms with that. And it is a reflection of the really terrible education that all Canadians receive still to this day. I mean, some provinces and territories are doing a bit of a better job, but even take myself. I mean, how did I get to know what I know? Well, I live in a territory that is very interwoven with Indigenous people. I had an opportunity to do some teaching at a community college where I had to learn in order to teach. Through that process, I learned stories that most Canadians have never heard. But it wasn't because I got it in curriculum. It wasn't because there's conversations happening around board tables and organizations. You know, everybody's using this word reconciliation like a buzzword. It actually kind of drives me crazy. I love the idea and the promise of reconciliation, but if you have one Indigenous person on your board of directors for any organization, you're not practicing reconciliation, you're practicing tokenism. And when we start to see deputy premiers and maybe premiers, and when we start to see organizations being led by Indigenous people, that to me is reconciliation. Self-determination is reconciliation. Land back is reconciliation. You know, the communities that are doing the best across the country are the ones that have land mass in which to do things on and to decide what they want to do in those spaces. That's reconciliation. Self-determination, that's to me the most important work our government will do, and the biggest legacy we'll leave are on settling land claims out of court and getting land back and creating enabling legislation for Indigenous people to take back control of what's rightfully theirs to determine. Child and family services, healthcare delivery, community policing. In fact, most communities don't call it community policing, community safety. These are the kinds of things that are going to transform and truly give us the promise of reconciliation. You know, equity would be nice to achieve one day. We keep fighting for that together.
Yes. And education for our people has always been at the forefront, and it's the passing of knowledge and building that self-awareness, let alone the ability for us to navigate in this world of two worlds, if you will. We're always fighting and being challenged to tell our story. How important is it for Canadians, especially in the education system from K to 12, if you will, to learn about the history of First Nations people, Indigenous people of this country?
I think it's actually critically important, and I think it's going to happen faster and faster as Indigenous people take back control of institutions and organizations and land and governance. But it's a huge barrier. It's a huge barrier to things that are life-saving, and it's really the nexus for me of entering federal politics was the intersection of Indigenous people and healthcare. And I probably don't have to tell you the experience that Indigenous people face in emergency rooms all across this country every single night. Every single night, there are people that are abused in the context of seeking urgent care. And every single night, people make decisions not to seek urgent care because they can't stand the thought of the psychological injury they're going to receive at the hands of people who are supposed to be providing equitable health care. So for me, that is a reflection of the lack. I mean, and listen, like, that's what colonialism is. It's about erasing. It's about a narrative that nobody existed here before. The land was for the taking. That the country was built through the hard work of European settlers. Like, these are the narratives that people actually fully believe because they've never ever been taught anything different. And they don't see the history of colonization and the impact that it's had on communities and how hard communities and indeed territories have had to fight to gain back their own self-determination. So this is the work ahead of us for all of us. And it's work that I hope I'll be able to do till the day that I die, is to try to transform systems and organizations. You know, I said to the CEO of the hospital, you know, one time I said, look, you know, you can do all the diversity training if you want. But one elder I know says that that's teaching cultural tourism. Like, why do you need to know how Indigenous people pray? You just need to know how to treat them like human beings. Like, what about care and compassion? If your philosophy is patient-centered care, then your staff don't necessarily need to know what a sweat lodge is. What they need to know is to respect the patient and the family to the degree that you would respect any other patient and family. And so And so sometimes I think we get lost a little because people say, oh, well, we can't do that. We need training. We need to understand Indigenous people. We need to understand their ceremony and their prayers and the way that they do things. And all that's like true, I suppose. That's great. But you don't need to do that to provide equitable services. What you need to do is treat everybody who's walking through that door as valuable and precious and important, and to listen to what people need to heal. And so that's what I challenge my community and my colleagues to do constantly, is to understand that, of course, we all need to know more. We should all want to know more, actually, about who we are sharing this land with and how different people imagine this land and imagine the spirituality of what it means to be alive and to be human. Those are all gifts, by the way, from Indigenous people that I take, and I take gratefully every day. But you don't need to know that to have an equitable service. You don't need to know that to run a shelter or a women's facility or a hospital in a way that treats people with compassion and care. So there's my rant for you.
Well, I appreciate that. And just to wrap things up, Minister, just in regards to your capacity and what your role is in Ottawa, how important is it for, like I mentioned, your colleagues to understand the journey that they're on, let alone the commitment? And I really appreciate your openness to talk about your past. And she is an MP for still a very tough part of Canada, coming from Thunder Bay, where there's still a lot of systematic racism, let alone racism within the community. How important is it for your colleagues to understand and appreciate the journey that we're on, and the opportunity they have not only to make changes for positivity in the country, but let alone for long-standing and long-term positive changes? Thank you.
Well, I think it's incumbent on all leaders at all levels, but certainly federal leaders, especially because we have additional tools, if you will, to move the system that much more quickly. The Prime Minister's written the mandate letters in a way, though, that insists that people and their departments are focusing on reconciliation, for lack of a better word, but the tools of reconciliation. And it's harder for some departments than others. You know, for even my department, which, you know, you would think is the kinder, gentler cousin, it is a department that was steeped in colonialism. The purpose of the department was to control Indigenous people. So you're changing the DNA of a department. That's hard work. You know, you can have the greatest people doing the greatest things, but if the entire thrust of the department is around control, you have to break down the steps to figuring out how you're going to change that DNA of that department. So think about fisheries. Some of you will have interaction with DFO. You know, a very colonial perspective and a very colonial mindset, changing, though, through the leadership of the Prime Minister and the mandates that he's providing ministers to do things differently, to put the rights of Indigenous people up front, to make sure that departments are changing their processes so that we're not ramrodding things through and forcing policy on Indigenous people, but rather shifting these huge machines of government to be working collectively with Indigenous people. That's, I think, the promise of the Prime Minister's vision and certainly the leadership at this time. But what I really hope is that it's not limited to federal politics. It has to be a drive through all politics. You know, you and I had a great conversation about municipalities and the importance of municipalities stepping into the space of making sure that all citizens are welcome and protected. In my riding of Thunder Bay Superior North, I am in regular conflict with the municipality because the municipality says these are not our people in a million ways. Where is the federal government? These are not our people. Who are these people? These are people who are born in Ontario, who live in the traditional territory, Fort William First Nation, and whether they were from, you know, Calgary or Wewakwe, they're here now, and they're our people. And we are each other's people. And when communities start to see that we are each other's people, that's when we're going to really thrive. But we have to do it at every level, because communities aren't built by the federal government. You know, federal government has two tools, really: legislation and money. That's it. Those are the two tools. But they don't make communities. They don't build houses. You know, we don't actually foster community growth. That has to happen at every level, and it has to happen interpersonally. And it starts by saying we're all each other's people. And so with that, merci cho for teaching me about who you are over the last few days and the last visit. It's been a wonderful, wonderful experience to be here again. And I'm coming back this summer to visit my kids. So you never know. Might be in some of your communities as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. I just want to thank you very much for joining us on the speaker series. So